Okay, so before we get started on this next part, I need to address something really quick because some of my fans are seriously having heart attacks and near-death experiences over it. The Chaos rules written on the cards takes place in all formats outside of Chaos's magic. What? Kudo got something wrong in one of his videos? Everybody flip out and send him 1,000 messages about it. I get it though, I'm sorry, I should have read up more about it. I totally didn't because I was lazy, and now it's been corrected. So let's move on. I was already planning on talking about chaotic cards in the last video of this series, and I was thinking of moving it up here so that I could show people that I do know a bit about the chaotic rules, but screw that. This is my video series, and I'm not going to switch it around just to please a few of you. Stay mad, nerds. We're gonna do events. First card we're gonna look at is Awkward Silence from Purple, and this is a really interesting card. The one thing that I really like about it is the fact that it only costs 1. Its timing is just during the problem face-off, so you could use this pretty much anytime something goes wrong. If your opponent is playing pink and they play that card Catch Me that gets rid of one of your good ponies or something, then you can use this to just end the face-off and not deal with it. You can use it if your opponent gets a really good card flip. You can use it if you know you're going to lose. You can use it to stall. It's got a lot of really good uses, and I want to see it a little bit in this new format. For Equestria is a really good event too. It has the Chaos effect. When it's flipped, it gets +1 power for each opposing character involved in the face-off, which actually isn't that great of a Chaos effect. And its regular effect is you can play it during a face-off, and one friend gets +1 power for each opposing character involved in the face-off until the end of the face-off. The reason I say that the Chaos effect isn't that good, but the face-off effect is pretty good, is if you flip this for like a Troublemaker face-off or something, then it's completely worthless. But if it's just during a regular face-off and it's in your hand, then you can choose when to use it, and it's a pretty good card. We've already seen effects like this in Purple on cards like Spring Forward that gain power based on how many characters your opponent has opposing you, and overall I just think it's a really good effect to have, and now that it's on an event card, it's a lot more versatile. I actually don't think this card's going to see a whole lot of play, but I do think it's a good card that's worth looking at. Miss Teleport is a fascinating card because it also has a lot of uses. It's a reaction, and it reacts to your opponent putting a friend into play. When your opponent plays a friend, you can move it to anywhere. The thing I like most about this is, like, the biggest play you're going to make with this obviously is just sending somebody home and making your opponent pay to move it, so it's going to be really good for like toll booth decks and stuff. But one other really good use it's going to have is for the Pinky Sparkle Surprise deck. See, you can use it to move one of your opponent's new characters to a problem that you want them to solve, and then you can initiate a face-off. Playing around card effects like that is kind of the key to what makes cards like this good. Like, you can move it in front of like your Spring Forward or your Big Top or something that you really want to have characters fighting against it, and your opponent actually kind of has to pay the 2 to move it away or something, and it's, I don't know, I think it has a lot of potential and I want to see it get some play. Perfect Teleport, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. At the beginning of any phase, you can get rid of one of your in-play friends, and then play it again during the next turn. I am in love with this card. I think it's such a cool idea. It's not a staple, it's not something that's going to be in every single purple deck or anything like that, but you can do so many just silly things with this card, because when you banish one of your friends, then it just says you can play it again. So at the beginning of your next turn, you can either put it in play at a problem that it wasn't at before, and it's kind of like moving it, or you can play something that has a really good on-play effect, like the Princess Luna that frightens a friend, or the Pinkie Pie that dismisses a friend, or something like that. And its effect happens again because it's considered being put into play. Like, Perfect Teleport and Pinky Responsibility Pie is one of the coolest things I think I've ever seen, because if you play Pinky Responsibility Pie, you dismiss a friend, and then your opponent plays some friends, and you play this during the end phase to get rid of Pinky Responsibility Pie, and then beginning of next turn, you just put it in play at the problem with the character you want to get rid of, and all of a sudden that friend is gone. It's just a cool idea. Next, we'll look at Private Journal. This has a couple of uses. First, Purple doesn't have a whole lot of things that let you see your opponent's hand, and having something like this is kind of helpful because it lets you know if you need to save any of your cards, or if, you know, what your biggest threats are going to be and what your opponent is planning. It also, since you're using it during the face-off, lets you choose what card your opponent is going to flip for a face-off. That is a lot of power to have. You can also kind of take it a step further by having them put something that you don't want them to play on top of their deck so that they automatically flip it for the face-off and it goes to the bottom of their deck. Like, if you're facing against a white deck and they have a rarity Truly Outrageous in their hand or something, you can just put that on top of the deck and then it goes to the bottom. And, you know, you could use it for that too, but that's getting a little too deep into it. Getting off of purple and onto yellow, I want to look at a Cuddle with Peckin Geese because I think this is an awesome card. Reveal the top card of your deck and you may draw it. If that card was a critter friend, you can pay one less to play that friend this turn and you may draw another card. Critter Rush decks haven't been getting a whole lot of love lately, and I just think a little card like this is really good for them. It's got 5, so you can flip it during face-offs and not be completely screwed, and it makes your critters cheaper. In fact, if you play this and you flip in like an owl or something, you can play the owl for free and then draw another card. Essentially, you're paying 1 to draw 2 cards, and one of them is a free owl. I think that's cool. Trampled is arguably not that good of a card, but I feel like it's an interesting card and I want to look at it. You can pay 1 to make one of your opponents lose 2 action tokens. I really don't know why I say one of your opponents, because right now the way the game is played is 1 versus 1, but apparently at some point it's going to become a bigger thing when you have like 2 versus 2, so on and so forth. If you happen to flip it during a face-off, then all of your opponents lose 1 action token. It's a little situational. I don't know if I like the chaos effect too much, but I do like the main phase effect. One opponent loses 2 action tokens. You're giving up 1 action token to make your opponent lose 2 action tokens. I mainly like effects like these because right now the way the game is played is we need very specific numbers of action tokens to make big plays. Like, most purple decks will wait until they have like 10 or 12 action tokens, and then they'll pull like 1 huge play off at a time. And just making your opponent lose 2 action tokens sets them back like 1 extra turn and gives you another turn to do stuff. And I think you've just got a lot of potential with stuff like this. When you're playing something like purple-yellow, there's already such a huge gap between yours and your opponent's action tokens anyway, and just anything you can do to make that gap even bigger is just amazing. Orange just keeps getting amazing cards. I don't know what it is, but somebody over there really likes Applejack. So, Nope is important for a few reasons. First of all, it's a reaction that happens at the beginning of any phase. Now, the main thing that makes this card really good and really annoying is the fact that you can use it at the beginning of the solve phase to just make it so your opponent cannot solve a problem that they would normally be able to solve. This is very important right now. There's a lot of mains that flip based on solving problems, and you can delay that. You can make it so that your opponent cannot score a bonus. Just overall, it's going to be the main use of the card, and it is a very good use to have. You can also use it if your opponent is going to end up solving a problem anyway, or if you plan on solving a problem and you know it's going to cause a face-off. You can use it to weaken that friend for the face-off, and that is really good. Like, the only stipulation it has is you have to use it at the beginning of the phase, but you can work around that, okay? Like, if you know your opponent's going to be able to solve a problem anyway, you can give one of their other friends -4, and all of a sudden, they're going to be weaker than you during the face-off. For 2 action tokens, it's pretty darn good. Finally, the last use I want to talk about is if you use it at the beginning of your opponent's main phase to give -4 to one of your opponent's colored friends that you know they're going to need, like if they're playing a purple-yellow deck, for example, and they've got 1 purple friend in play, you can use it to guarantee your opponent will not have enough power in that color to play any new friends. That is pretty messed up. Popping Corn, another pretty amazing reaction card. After the start of the score phase, you can choose a problem, and then exhaust every character there with 2 or less power, and if your opponent's main is boosted, it's 3 or less instead. So obviously this is kind of a mixed bag because it exhausts your friends too. But again, that can be worked around. If you've got all friends with 4 or more power, then you can pretty much just make it your opponent's side of the field. Since it's after the start of the score phase, you can manipulate it into winning you some face-offs. Overall, it's just a really good card that orange players should be looking at. So getting on to white, Cruel Taskmistress is going to be an interesting card because it's going to be very useful in purple and white and almost nothing else. It's a very situational card, so it's not something you want to be counting on unless you have a guaranteed way to move your opponent's friends around. Like if you're playing a purple and white deck. If you're playing purple and white, and you move your opponent's characters around, like if your opponent moves a character to a problem and then boosts so that they're at 3 power, then you can move some other friends over there, play Cruel Taskmistress, and just start clearing their board. It's not the most efficient removal, but it is a good card to have at 1 or 2. Photo Op is a pretty lolsy card. Its chaos effect is when this card's flipped, choose a problem. That problem's bonus is 0 until the end of the turn, which is okay because if you're going to lose the face-off, then your opponent doesn't really get a bonus for it. But its main effect is after the start of the main phase, characters can't be moved this turn. So hilarious because you can use this after a face-off has occurred, like during your opponent's next turn after all their friends have been moved home, and all their friends at home are completely useless and so is their main because everybody's at home and they cannot be moved. I mean, your opponent can still play stuff from the hand, but if your opponent's got a lot of really good stuff you know they want to use at home, then this pretty much just makes them useless for 1 turn. So I'm already laying out all the plans for a Queen Chrysalis deck, and I am so excited about Risky Business. You get to search your opponent's deck for a friend and set it aside face down. Now hold on, stop right there. The ability to look through your opponent's deck is amazing. Obviously, this is kind of an unintended use of the card, but if you are a pretty experienced player or you know a lot about the people you're playing against, then you can look through their deck to kind of guess what they have in their hand or guess what kind of the idea of their deck is. Your opponent cannot hide anything. You get to look through their entire deck, you get to see how many copies of each card they have, what kind of strategy they're going to play with. It's really broken. Afterwards, you can take any one of their friends and set it to the side. Your opponent then tries to guess which friend you took. If they guessed correctly, then they get to put that friend in play for free. However, if you were able to outsmart them and take something that they weren't expecting, and they guess it wrong, then you get to put it in play under your control for free. Obviously, it's a little bit risky because if your opponent knows what you're doing, or if there's one friend you really want to take and your opponent knows exactly what you're doing, then they have the chance of getting it for free and it's just something else you have to deal with. But overall, I think the payoff is well worth it, because even if that happens, you got to look through their entire deck and memorize their cards. Now, obviously, they shuffle their deck. I'm not saying that you get to memorize the order of their cards or anything, but I'm just saying that the ability to look through your opponent's deck is ridiculous, regardless of what the downsides are. Taking a look at blue, we're going to start off with Epic Win, a card that is going to be in every blue deck at least 1 copy. After the start of your Troublemaker phase, defeat an opponent's Troublemaker. It's pretty darn simple. Regardless of what the Troublemaker is, regardless of whether or not it's a villain, regardless of how difficult it would normally be to defeat it, how many characters you have there, it's just defeated now, you get some free points, and that's the end of it. This is a very powerful option and out to a lot of very problematic Troublemakers that we have now. I've been talking about how Frightened decks are going to make a comeback, and how they're going to be a very serious deck now, and this card is one of the reasons. You can dismiss a Frightened friend now for 1 cost. That is ridiculously good, especially because now we have a main character that totally frightens friends. We don't even have to really rely on the Goosebump control or anything like that anymore. Pretty much any blue deck that's running the new Luna as their main character can just dismiss friends now. And I think that's really cool. Even if you end up flipping this card for a face-off or something, it's 5 power. It's just a really good card, and I know it's going to see a lot of play. While we're on the subject of Frighten Control, we have Spooky Scary Story. Its main phase effect is Frighten up to 2 friends at home, and its chaos effect is when this card is flipped, Frighten a friend at home. I'll be completely honest, this card isn't as useful as a lot of other frightened effects that we have. The ability to frighten 2 friends in and of itself is an inherently good ability, especially for 2 because it costs your opponent 4 to unfrighten the friends. At home is really situational. The main problem that I have with this is its main use is going to be for cards like Cloud Chaser and All Team Organizer that your opponent really isn't worried about moving to problems anyway. And even then, that's kind of late into the game. I'm probably going to run this card at like 1 when I do rebuild the Frighten deck, but it's still a card that I feel like is worth noting if you are building a Frighten deck. Some people are also going to argue that this is pretty decent for movement decks, but honestly, like going through the trouble of moving your opponent's friends home is not really worth it. Like the only thing that I could see kind of being worth it is if you use the Cutie Pox scare to move everybody home, and then you play Spooky Scary Story right afterwards to frighten a couple of friends. That's a very viable strategy and something that I would recommend doing, but it's still kind of situational and still kind of a lot of work to just frighten 2 friends. The last card we'll look at in blue is Two of a Kind. I really like this card. It's a reaction after a Troublemaker is uncovered. You can move up to 2 of your characters to that Troublemaker's problem. The main thing I want to talk about here is the fact that it doesn't say your opponents, it just says a Troublemaker. So this is also going to be useful for Troublemaker control decks, because you yourself can play a Troublemaker, flip it, and then move 2 of your characters to that problem. Obviously, if your opponent flips a Troublemaker, then you can use this to move a couple of characters over there to get ready to defeat it. This is a little bit not as useful because we've got Epic Win, but it is still kind of useful because if you move 2 of your characters over to that Troublemaker and then defeat it, then those characters get to stay there and solve that problem that turn. Pink's got a couple of events to look at too, like this old switcheroo. Choose one of your friends out of problem, your opponent chooses one of their friends out of problem, and you exchange control of those friends until the end of the score phase. This can have a few really interesting results. It's in pink, so if you play something like Pinky Responsibility Pie at a problem to get rid of 1 friend, then you can play this card and switch your Pinky Responsibility Pie with one of your opponent's better friends and use it to solve a problem or something like that. Its main use, and the one that I'm most excited about, is the fact that you can switch the friends, and then if you have some kind of card or effect that lets you retire one of your friends, you now control their friend, so you just get rid of their friends to get whatever the effect is. Probably the most famous is going to be the colorless slave driver that was in the last video. You can play that, get rid of their friend, get the +1 counter, and then at the end of the score phase, you get your friend back. It's not something that'll be in every deck, but in the decks that it is in, it's going to be interesting to see how people react to something like that. The last peak event we'll look at is Chaos Capital of the World, and this is a very interesting card. Its chaos effect is if you flip it over during a face-off, you can turn each main character over. That is really interesting, because if your opponent has boosted their main and you haven't, then pretty much you can boost your main and your opponent unboosts their main. It can also be useful for things like if you're building a pink-white and you're using Queen Chrysalis as your main character, you can flip it over and then use its effect again to take control of another friend and reboost it. So many possibilities. I kind of wish it didn't cost 4. Costing 4 is kind of but it's well worth it if you can figure out a way to play around it. Its other effect is turn each character over. Turn each character over is very interesting because that means that all of the friends who are unfrightened become frightened and all of the frightened friends become unfrightened. Holy cow, that can really turn a game around if you know your opponent's going to use something that involves frightened. So, I don't know, kind of situational. If you are using a main character that has a really good effect that lets you flip into your boosted state, and then your boosted state doesn't really have an effect, I can see kind of abusing this a little bit to just keep reflipping your main over and over again, like Queen Chrysalis or the new orange main. But overall, I just think this is a really interesting card to look at. Before we look at the Epiphanies, I want to look at this colorless event called Double Trouble. So any deck can use this, and it's just during a Troublemaker face-off, you can flip an additional card. This is good for a couple of reasons. First of all, obviously, you get more power, so you have more of a chance of beating the Troublemaker, but its other good use is the fact that if your deck has a lot of Chaos cards in it, then you get more Chaos effects. So if you're building a deck around Chaos, keep this card in mind. It could be very, very useful. So there's a new set of events out called Epiphany cards, and there's one for each main character, so one for each color. And I'm not going to look at all of them because not all of them are that good. I think I'm going to leave off like one or two, but for the most part they're pretty good. They all give 3 different effects, but you can only choose 2 of them to use at once. The main use for this obviously is going to be exhausting one of your opponent's characters and then readying one of your characters. If you don't really need to ready one of your characters or exhaust one of your opponent's characters, you can also get rid of a resource. That's definitely an option too. Next up we have Pinky's Epiphany, and I really like this card. Its effects are dismiss a friend with 2 or less power, makes sense for Pink. Put a friend from your discard pile into your hand, or pay 2 less for the next card you play this turn. This is a really good card. Obviously, you're mainly going to be using it to dismiss a friend with 2 or less power, and then pay 2 less for the next card you play this turn, because this is kind of an expensive card. But if your opponent doesn't have any friends you want to get rid of, you have the ability to just choose a friend from your discard pile that you like, put it in your hand, and then play that very card for 2 less. I'm sure you can see why that's good. So Rainbow's Epiphany. Move one of your friends, put this card on top of your deck, or flip an additional card. There's one thing about this card I don't really like, and that's put this card on top of your deck. I think that's really, really dumb because it's only got 3 power, and I don't see why you'd ever want to do this, except maybe in the cases where your opponent is trying to manipulate what card's on top of your deck. And giving up the 3 power, just, I don't see it. I don't think it's that good. But its other 2 effects, move one of your friends and flip an additional card, are good because you can move a friend that wasn't previously in the face-off into the face-off, and you can flip an additional card. Rarity's Epiphany, dismiss a friend without an attached resource, put a resource from your discard pile into your hand, or put an accessory from your hand into play attached to a friend. Can we just be real for a second? The first effect in Rarity's Epiphany is better dismissal power than the Pink Epiphany. That feels pretty wrong to me. I don't think that should have happened, but anyways. Rarity's Epiphany, obviously good because every single time you're going to be able to dismiss a friend, okay? There's obviously going to be somebody on your opponent's side of the board that you don't like that doesn't have a resource attached. If you have a deck that is using a lot of good accessories, then I could see its 3rd effect being pretty useful, but normally you're going to also choose its 2nd effect, which lets you put a resource from your discard pile into your hand. So mainly it's going to be used to get more Tangled Coifers, I would say. The very last card we'll be looking at today is Twilight's Epiphany. Choose 2, move an opposing character, opponents can't move their characters this turn, draw 3 cards. This, in all honesty, I believe is the best of the Epiphany cards. If you have a different opinion, that's fine. But in my opinion, I think Twilight's Epiphany is the best. Move an opposing character and opponents can't move their characters this turn is probably my favorite of the effects because you can move one of their characters at a problem home and then your opponent just cannot move anything else. That is so beautiful to me. If for some reason one of those effects doesn't really work out for you, like if you don't really need to move an opposing character, if you just want to make it so your opponent can't move any of their characters this turn, or you want to move a character but it doesn't really matter if your opponents move their characters this turn because they're out of action points or something, then you can just draw 3 cards, because why not? Because paying 2 to move a character and draw 3 cards isn't completely obnoxiously broken. And with that, I think that's a pretty good note to leave off on. If there are any cards that you saw in the new set that I didn't talk about, then why don't you talk about them in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave it a like, those things really do help us out. And finally, subscribe to stay up to date on the latest Kudo news. I'll see you all in part 4.